Marvel vs. Capcom is easily one of the greatest franchise crossover series in the entire history of video games. These unbelievable titles would let players face off as characters from different universes that no one had ever thought would collide. Not only that, but some of these titles are now considered amongst the best fighting games of all time, and are celebrated for their deep character rosters, unusual combinations of fighters, tag team mechanics, and signature chaotic action. The Marvel vs. Capcom series is the stuff of legends. So, if this is all the case, how could it even be possible for a great concept of this magnitude to have such a dramatic fall from grace? The Marvel vs. Capcom crossover brand felt unstoppable. So what went wrong that would cause all of this to come crashing down, and ultimately result in an end of this series? Well, one word people, Disney. The same brand responsible for bringing countless amazing iconic properties adored by fans to their knees. So keeping this in mind, after Disney purchased Marvel, how would they meddle with this Capcom classic series to ensure its destruction? Let's find out. Hello ladies and gentlemen, Big Daddy Top Hat here. This is the story of Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, the game that destroyed the franchise. Yeah. Marvel vs. Capcom, what a legacy these games have. With its roots in 1994, gamers were wowed by the appearance of Akuma in X-Men Children of the Atom. The public were shocked and pleasantly surprised to see a character from Street Fighter within an X-Men game. It was just such a cool spectacle to see this happen. Capcom took note of the positive reaction this received, so by 1996, to the delight of the gaming public, they would release an entire X-Men vs. Street Fighter crossover fighting game. This was the title that introduced the many mechanics and conventions that would go on to make the series so popular. Air combat, tag team action, huge ridiculous moves, and matches gamers never thought possible. It was all here, and it was just so awesome to see such an insane concept come to life. The success of this game would spawn many sequels, with the franchise arguably peaking at its 4th entry, Marvel vs. Capcom 2, the most ambitious crossover game ever made by that point, with a roster of 56 characters and the tag team system being tweaked to allow 3-on-3 matches. The game was a work of art. Past this point, fighting games would fall out of favour for a bit, and development houses such as Capcom would majorly slow down their production and development of such titles. But 11 years after the release of Marvel vs. Capcom 2, in a period after Street Fighter 4 had helped rejuvenate the fighting game market, Marvel vs. Capcom 3 arrived in 2011. The game is notable for being the first title to be released in the series after Marvel had been acquired by Disney. The game was well received at the time, and it is once again enjoyed by players today, but there was a period whereby Disney would block gamers from being able to download it. The reason for this was because Disney claimed they were not renewing the Marvel vs. Capcom license anymore, as they wanted the Marvel characters to be exclusive to their own games published by Disney Interactive Studios. This would result in the huge push of Disney Infinity, an action-adventure sandbox toys-to-life game that was basically a complete shameless rip-off of Skylanders. These games, which were sold to Shift physical toys, featured open-world creation, story-driven gameplay, and additional features that could only be brought into the game by purchasing their overpriced plastic figurines. As we now know, Disney are not the only ones who could smell money in this field, as Nintendo would choose to do exactly the same thing with their Amiibo range. But with all of these big corporate brands putting out the same sort of products, all within a fairly short time frame, this craze would not last long at all. So by 2016, the Disney Infinity series was just as cancelled as Marvel vs. Capcom. This endeavour would not prove to be the easy-to-milk cash cow that Disney had hoped for, and realising they were not cut out to be developing games at that time, they would revert back to the old method of outsourcing their licenses to developers and publishers with experience in the field who actually knew what they were doing. This terrible showing by Disney would fortunately lead to something amazing happening that would be music to the ears of Marvel vs. Capcom fans everywhere. At a Sony PlayStation Experience press conference, it would be announced that not only was Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 going to be made, once again available in digital stores, but Disney had also given Capcom the licensing rights to create an all-new game known as Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, which was set to be released in 2017. Marvel vs. Capcom was officially back. The new project was to be directed by Norio Hirose, a man who worked as a programmer of the series since X-Men vs. Street Fighter back in 1996. Development of the title was split between several different parties, with Capcom of Japan, Capcom USA, and Marvel Games themselves all playing an active role. The concept, which they intended to deliver on, was to create a game which was both complex and hardcore like traditional fighting games of old, but to also be a game that was more elegant and simplified than many created in the past. As usual, like with most modern fighters, attempting to appeal to as wide a market as possible. I have noted in the past how games such as Street Fighter 4 and Marvel vs. Capcom 3 were already much more simplistic than games that had come before them, with the entries in the Street Fighter 3 series being prime examples of more complex fighters that had commercially failed. These sort of games did not sell well on release due to not appealing strong enough to the casual market, a problem that Capcom rectified with their later titles with their more simplified experiences. These games sold very well, so it is no surprise really that Capcom intended to double down even further on simplicity. Perhaps even more excitingly for Capcom, to Disney's credit, the Marvel brand was only getting bigger and bigger. There was now an even larger casual market for Marvel characters than there was in the past, as the success of the Marvel Cinematic Universe had put the brand in an entire different stratosphere to its place in the world from where it was back in 1996 with the release of X-Men vs. Street Fighter. Superheroes were mainstream and in many ways legitimately cool. Now, there is a lot to get through with regards to what Capcom and Co did to attempt to make something that was even more simplistic than the likes of Marvel vs. Capcom 3. So let's go through the many elements that make up this final installment in the series. Capcom analysed that many people who had played the last entry in the series view the game as way too overwhelming, with just far too much going on. For this reason, to attempt to make Infinite more accessible to everyone, the series' famed 3-on-3 battle system would be completely phased out and replaced with more simplistic 2-on-2 battles, a move that many gamers would instantly see as a massive step backwards for the series. As you can imagine, the axing of the 6-man tag action was hugely disappointing to many fans of the series. Previously, the game had always been championed for including more and more elements, and the 3-on-3 tag-in tag-out battles were one of the key features as to why Marvel vs. Capcom 2 was so loved in the first place. Further to this, the previous game's chaotic nature was a staple of the series that set it apart from other games in the same genre, so this move not only seemed to be diluting the franchise to bring it more in line with other fighters, but customers would also feel cheated having elements removed from a game rather than being added. How irritating. Speaking of removing things, the reduction of fighters in each match was not the only feature that would be removed from combat, as to quote Capcom, things would be streamlined further. A previous well-known inclusion in the series was the ability to call in other characters to perform assist moves. Such a mechanic was completely taken out of the game and instead replaced with a new feature involving the Infinity Stones. The 6 Infinity Stones can be loosely compared to the grooves in the Capcom vs SNK games, offering players slightly different fighting game mechanics. Although, rather than being placed in the game to present players with further customization, it seems as though they were mainly featured in order to further level up the playing field in matches, arguably assisting in damaging the competitive nature of the game and instead opening up more possibilities for less skilled players to win matches. The Infinity Stone's main purpose functions as a comeback enabler, compensating for losing characters' deficiencies by enhancing their strong points. As we know, there are a lot of marketing reasons why the name Infinite was used for the title, but obviously the Infinity Stones themselves further tie into this theme, with one developer stating the goal was for the stones to present players with infinite gameplay possibilities. Fortunately, like previous entries, the Hyper Combo gauge is featured within this game, and gradually fills up as characters deal and receive damage. Filling this up allows players to perform traditional hyper combos, but now a move called a counter switch is also executable. Counter switches lets characters tag out instantly, even whilst an opponent is attacking them, allowing combos to be broken more simply than previously by allowing for easy counter-attack opportunities. Something that may come as a surprise considering that Disney and Capcom were looking to simplify everything, Capcom chose to return to the old 4 attack button layout, which had not been seen since much earlier entries in the series. I guess this must have been one of the features included, what Capcom were referring to when they said right at the beginning they were intending to include some aspects in the game that made it closer to Marvel vs. Capcom games of old. To be fair, this does not particularly damage the game's accessibility, which seems to be the main angle Capcom really wanted to push, due to the fact that combos in this one are performable simply by tapping the light punch button both on the ground and in the air, meaning in theory even a 3-year-old could perform combos in this game. Even hyper combos were made executable by just pressing the 2 heavy attack buttons at once. The removal of specific joystick and button combinations removed a layer of skill from the game, again something that not many long-term fans of the series were particularly happy about. So that's the basic mechanical changes to the game, but as you know, there were more factors that made Marvel vs. Capcom so popular in the past that were down to more than simply just the combat system. So despite the fighting mechanics themselves debatably being gimped, does this game at least bring a charming, innovative roster to the table? Well, let's discuss. In the past, it seems each entry seemed to bring some kind of cool gimmick to the roster. The first game lets us play as both the X-Men and the Street Fighter characters. The second game gave us other Marvel fighters to play as. The next one gave us new characters on the Capcom side of things. The fourth entry gave us a gigantic roster. And the fifth game ended up giving us a large roster too. This time made up with plenty of completely new fighters. They all brought us something unique. So did Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite provide us with an infinite amount of fighters to choose from? Well, obviously, absolutely not. Marvel vs. Capcom 2 gave us 56 fighters. Ultimate Marvel vs. Capcom 3 gave us 48. Whereas Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite shortchanged gamers by giving us a launch lineup roster selection of only 30 different characters, which was a huge step backwards. But I guess at least it falls in line with Capcom's aim at the time to simplify things. So I guess reducing players' choices seems to have been one of their methods in achieving this feat. This would be more acceptable if we got 30 great characters, but what we actually got was very disappointing. Out of the 30 characters who were chosen for the game, only 5 of those were new to the franchise, with the rest returning from previous games. On the Capcom side of things, we received X as a playable fighter, the lead character from the Mega Man X series, and Jeddah, the final boss from Darkstalkers 3. In terms of Marvel characters, the newbies would include Gamora from Guardians of the Galaxy, along with Ultron from the Avengers series, and Captain Marvel. Apart from wanting to simplify things, I personally feel that Capcom intentionally limited the lineup in order to encourage players to fork out even more money for the game's DLC characters. 6 characters who should have been in the game in my opinion from day one anyway. Marvel vs. Capcom is about huge rosters and chaotic nonsense, so they shouldn't have been changing this now. In regards to the DLC, Black Panther, Black Widow, the Winter Soldier, Sigma, Monster Hunter and Venom could all be downloaded. But Venom was a character who was free in all of the previous games in the series, which made this all the more frustrating. Apart from making gamers have to pay an additional fee to add fighters to the game's bare bones lineup, an element that made all of this even more annoying is that many beloved fighters from the series were left out altogether. Most notably, the majority of characters from the Street Fighter franchise, and even more alarmingly, the game features not even one single character from the X-Men. The Marvel franchise that was the key focus of the crossover series over the entire 20 years prior. Reportedly, when it comes to the game's character roster, in terms of the characters featured in this, it is said that Marvel Studios called many of the shots, prioritising characters based on how important they were to their stupid cinematic universe they were heavily marketing at the time, rather than including superheroes with established lasting appeal. Basically, characters were chosen by Disney for product placement purposes, rather than trying to deliver the most likeable roster possible. You know, fighters fans of a series actually wanted. Many found it absolutely despicable that there were no X-Men to be found in the game, particularly bearing in mind the success of these crossover games had been built around them, and many wanted to see their favourites return. So what on earth was going on that would result in perhaps the best Marvel vs. Capcom characters being shelved altogether? Well, Disney greed, of course. In terms of movie licensing, despite Disney owning Marvel Studios, in 2016 Fox held the movie rights to the X-Men franchise, From what I can tell, there was absolutely no reason that the entire X-Men lineup had to be left out of the game, other than the fact that Disney actively chose to discard them as they couldn't be used to promote one of their own movies. Having no X-Men present instantly stopped this title feeling congruent with the rest of the series. Hilariously, Capcom producer Peter Rosas, aka Combofiend, attempted to justify this greedy corporate nonsense by making up an excuse for the X-Men being missing from the game, stating, "We talked with Marvel very closely about their future roadmap, about what's going to be happening. Your modern Marvel fan, maybe they don't even remember some of the X-Men characters, but they know some of the Guardian characters, or Black Panther, you know what I mean. Captain Marvel may seem like a strange pick, but she's fantastic. She fits the gameplay, she fits the story, and they're going to be really pushing for her as a strong female lead all the way up into the movie. We're trying to take everything into account and choose the best characters." So yeah, according to one of the most important people who worked on this project, people apparently didn't know who the X-Men were anymore, and gamers would all soon be worshipping Disney's depiction of Captain Marvel instead. Speaking of which, comment below, who do you prefer? Capcom's depiction of the X-Men or Disney's Captain Marvel? I'd be eager to hear your thoughts. Amusingly, Rosas doubled down on his opinion by trying to claim X-Men characters in previous Marvel vs. Capcom entries had only ever been popular due to their function, rather than, you know, most casual players just enjoying iconic character design. To be exact, he would state, if you were to actually think about it, these characters are just functions. They're just doing things. Magneto, case in point, is a favourite because he has an 8-way dash, and he's really fast, right? So our most technical players, all they want is to do triangle jump and that kind of stuff. Well, guess what? Nova can do the same thing, Captain Marvel can do the same thing, Ultron can do the same thing. Go ahead and try them out. Now, Peter. Believe it or not, people enjoy playing fighting games for reasons other than becoming absolute combo fiends. The tournament scene and competitive play is a small part of things for most of the market, with the majority just wanting to be able to play the game with their favourite fighters, especially a game full of Marvel fighters. All in all, I have to say, I find Rosas' gymnastics quite hilarious, especially with regards to him trying to justify as to why there were no X-Men included in the game. I understand that it would probably not be a good look for him or Capcom admitting that the X-Men were left out simply because Disney didn't have an X-Men movie coming out, but trying to claim they are not popular and no one really wants to play as them was just plain ridiculous. What a sad state of affairs. So thus far, discussing this car crash of a game, we have established that we have scaled back fighting mechanics, a puny roster, missing some of the most popular Marvel characters of all time, but maybe the play mode saved this. So let's see what the game offered in that department. Around the time frame the game was released, Capcom were not strangers to criticism, and had made blunders with their fighting games prior to this one. Street Fighter V, for example, came under harsh criticism, due to the amount of content available in the game being quite frankly abhorrent on release, and server issues delivered a poor online multiplayer experience in the early days too. Holding these thoughts, Capcom were looking to at least deliver better on features like this with Marvel vs. Capcom Infinite, so that they could right some of their previous wrongs. This would mean that Infinite would feature many standard fighting game play modes, something that somehow Street Fighter V had managed to lack. But on top of all of that too, the game would feature an all-new play mode, set to heavily target that huge diverse audience and casual players who are enjoying the now huge Marvel Cinematic Universe. In fact, with regards to touching on this, something I have not at all mentioned yet, which you would have at least noticed plenty of times in this video, is the game's new cinematic graphical style. This differed from the previous entry in the series, Marvel vs. Capcom 3, which featured characters who looked like they were 3D models based on how characters were drawn in Marvel comic books. This game features a more realistic look to fall further in line with Disney's money-spinning movies. Capcom are really hoping to hook into the market who love these films, which is where a new play mode comes in, known as Infinite Story Mode. This is a 2-hour cinematic story campaign featuring story cutscenes and dialogue. The cheesy story ties all of the characters from the game into one cohesive narrative, which kind of reminds me of the subspace emissary that was featured in Super Smash Bros. Brawl a decade prior. The story delivers cringe-worthy one-liners delivered almost entirely without charm, but at least it is something new for the franchise, if we are going to draw any positives here. Reading various reviews that were published around this game's release, review scores seemed to be average, with a mix of praise and criticism being presented. Many journalists were disappointed though, due to many of the faults we've already gone over. Some elements did go down very well though, such as the Infinity Stone system, which IGN noted was a highlight of the game for them. Speaking of IGN, they were disgusted with the game's story and roster though, stating its story is dreadful, and its characters look like they were deliberately designed to spawn a million derpy memes. As discussed previously, the goal for Capcom with this one was to create a game with simplified play mechanics that would appeal to the gigantic market who watch Marvel movies. Capcom were unfortunately not capable of pulling this feat off, as the game would massively underperform commercially, even putting off many members of the already established Marvel vs Capcom fanbase. Capcom were extremely confident that this game would shift a bare minimum of 2 million units, with a hope of selling much more if they got things right. The game never even got close to its sales target though, only selling around 1 million copies, and when you consider the popularity of the MCU, that's a bit embarrassing really. Within Capcom's 2018 integrated report, Capcom described sales for Infinite as weak, stating Marvel vs Capcom Infinite delivered a certain level of sales, primarily overseas owing to deep-rooted popularity, but underperformed overall. Considering the commercial failings of this game, I see it as highly unlikely that there will be another Marvel vs Capcom game ever again. But which part is most to blame with regards to all of this? Can we credit Disney with being the entity who destroyed this franchise? Well, personally, I would blame equally both parties, as they both failed to deliver an experience worthy of the Marvel vs Capcom crossover brand. Disney should certainly be held accountable for depriving long-term fans of the ability to play as the X-Men. The X-Men, along with the cast of Street Fighter, are the very reason this crossover formula started, so to exclude them from the game is frankly ridiculous, even if Disney were not releasing any movies featuring the X-Men at the time. Blatant corporate greed has never been more transparent than it is when looking at the Marvel vs Capcom Infinity roster. Speaking of greed, it is greed that seems to be the running theme that looks to have destroyed any chances of this game becoming an all-time great. Capcom intentionally nuked most of the intricacies, six-man action and chaos that made this franchise so popular in the first place. They threw away most of what fans enjoyed and were familiar with, simply to try and cater to a larger market who would ultimately ignore that this game exists anyway. Their greed would mean that they would satisfy no one. Disney certainly contributed to destroying Marvel vs Capcom, but Capcom seemed to play their equal role in the affair too. Despite the death of a once great franchise, all is not lost, as we still have all the great games from the series to go back and play. Games from a time period when Capcom were making games to simply deliver the best experiences possible, rather than trying to appeal to markets that simply were not there, or trying to fleece the consumers through microtransactions. If you enjoyed this video and want more content like this, subscribe now, then why not check out my video on the worst Street Fighter protagonist ever. Yeah, cheerio.